Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm delighted to be joined by George and Johan from Prism, a really innovative solution which focuses on political and associated macroeconomic risk, and Michelle from Trust Your Supplier, one of the Prism partners. George, Johan, Michelle, welcome. Thank you all for joining me.
Welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk today about what Prism can do and how that can sort of work alongside the Trust Your Supplier solution. I thought it'd be good to start with asking the guys from Prism, what is it in headline terms that your solution actually does for customers with supply chain challenges?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, as I said, thanks for having us, Andrew. I mean, what we do, as you mentioned in the beginning, is we work on macro risk, what we call macro risk. So that's a broad term for a variety of things that affect you from the outside world that you don't have so much control over. So that could be geopolitics, it could be macroeconomics, it could be domestic politics, it could be regulatory or weather-related natural disasters. There's a whole host of things that are really becoming more and more of a problem for supply chain and procurement leaders that we work on to provide insight onto so that they can help manage their risk better. So what we do is we work with clients to better understand what's going on in the global environment, in particular in a way that's customized to where their exposures are. So different companies have different footprints. You're buying different things and moving different things around the world in various types of ways. That makes you more or less exposed to different types of countries or different types of problems that might arise. So we work to develop custom solutions for what the major things that you need to be tracking are, and then providing a research, data, briefing and expertise service that provides you everything you need to know about what is happening there and translates that messy world of noisy news into something digestible and actionable for you to manage risk on.
And Michelle, Trust Your Supplier, you're working alongside George and Johan with some customers. Could you perhaps give us some insight into how the solutions work together effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's first really important to explain who Trust Your Supplier are as well. So from our perspective, we are a multi-dimensional third-party risk solution. And what that really means is that we're providing our customers with reliability, integrity, quality of data, making sure that you're aware of any supply chain risk right the way through your life cycle. So that's from the moment that you want to do a sourcing activity right the way through to procurement, invoicing, etc. And with part of that, it also means that we need to be aware of any standards, compliance regulations, requirements consistently. So how does that link up with Prism? Well, from a Prism perspective, geopolitics, macroeconomic risk, it's really crucial for the supply chain. It's going to influence, if we're made aware of it in advance, trade routes, availability of resources, political stability, regulatory environments, international relations, especially where there are countries where maybe they're very specific for a source. If we think of oil, if we think of conflict minerals, those particular areas are only very limited sourcing areas of those. And if we don't have this knowledge that Prism can provide, then of course that can be detrimental to any supply chain. So we want to use Prism to ensure that our buyers or our customers are aware of that risk associated long before they invite suppliers to join our network.
So the next question, it's quite a simple question, is how does it all work then? George, Johan, could you perhaps give us some insight into the sort of mechanics behind it?
Yeah, I can take that one as well. So there's a few components to how it works. The first thing I'd say is designing of a dashboard, I think, is really the key central step, because what matters is understanding what are the key topics that matter to you from a macro perspective that are driving risk, and are therefore the ones that you need to track. And what we do is we split between tracked risks, sort of the known knowns, as it were, and emerging risks, which are more things that we want to make you aware of that you might not know, are things that are bubbling up and that might have an impact on you in the sort of medium to long term. but that we're tracking and understanding might be relevant for you and alerting you to. So step one is really coming up with that dashboard so that you have a simple sort of 30-second constant view of what's going on that's going to be impactful to you. Then there's a sort of reporting function where every one of those topics needs to be researched to see what's going on and to provide updates in a sort of digestible and actionable way. And on that front, I think really the core thing that we do is try and translate that very noisy world that I mentioned before into something that's nicely synthesized and clearly understandable for everybody in your organization, from the CPO, Chief Supply Chain Officer, to all the way down to category managers and people who are making more day-to-day decisions on those things. So there's a lot of detailed reports on each of those topics that would be on your dashboard. And then we have briefings and webinars and things like that make things a bit more interactive. And then finally, I think the other key thing to mention is data. We have a variety of data outputs. Firstly, including sort of general macro information that are about countries or different categories, but also more custom indices and scores that help you understand what is the risk level from a supply disruption perspective, or what is the risk level from an ESG perspective if you were to source in this country versus that country. So that's sort of the core offering. And then we work a lot more closely with clients on top of that to help specifically prepare them in terms of, now that you know all of this information and you've identified something on an ongoing basis that's going to be a really big risk, what are you going to do about it specifically, and coming up with response plans. But those can be war games or more consulting type engagements, but the core offering is the three things I mentioned above.
Michelle, having access to that sort of information must be a game changer for your solution.
Oh, listen, this is why I love having these conversations with Prism. You don't really realize until you have these discussions, understand what's happening, how that can impact supply chains. And I think, let's take a supplier, and a customer, and give them some examples. You've got things like US-China trade wars as an example, where there's the imposition of tariffs disrupted global supply chains. We're all aware of that. Going towards people like Prism can look and anticipate those risks, can diversify supply chain offerings by giving them other opportunities. Middle East complex, that instability that we've seen over the past few years, in that region can disrupt oil supplies, impacting global energy markets, transportation costs, sanctions that we've seen today. Though a lot of those sanctions on raw materials, agricultural products, elements like that, all of that our supply chain need to be aware of, and not just at the beginning when they're onboarding suppliers, but right the way through the life cycle. And that mitigation, that predictiveness, that opportunity that Prism provides is just instrumental to successful supply chains in the future.
So we all know about COVID, which is obviously spoken about in supply chain. We've got lots of elections this year. We've got a number of different sort of challenges economically in recent years. How would you summarize the way macro risk has changed for procurement professionals and supply chain professionals, of course, in recent times? Who would like to take that one first?
The one thing that I always stress for everybody is, and I think I mentioned at the very beginning, how quick our supply chain risks are. If I think of ESG as an example, and the amount of ESG sanctions that George mentioned earlier, how does that present issues or concerns across the supply chain, new laws that come into place, how's that going to impact where you're going to get your supply from, resource capability, some of those areas, in the eastern side of Europe at the moment, where we had this fundamental wealth of IT technology within, the Ukrainian area, that resource is pretty much disappeared. Lots of our buyers are, saying, where else can I get this particular resource from? Working with Prism, that's where you need to look at it. From our perspective, we probably would have spoken to CPOs primarily. They're the ones that are interested in, sourcing materials, products, services, etc. Now that's expanded, and I think Prism have probably seen that as well. We're now talking to compliance officers. We're even talking to HR teams. where they're going, what is happening in areas that we either want to set up a business or we also want to procure or produce products and services. You need to be aware of that at all stages. And I think that's where, solutions like Prism are really going to come into play a lot more.
So there's a recognition, or there's a realization that so many organisations are taking this much more seriously. Is that the net result of all these sort of high-profile challenges that we've all seen in the last 2 or 3 years? Is that the net result?
From my perspective, absolutely. The ability to see multi-dimensional risk is critical. That is predictive risk, the ability to foresight what's happening within, those areas that George is mentioning, and then to actually put it into practice, and then taking it a step further and going, now that I know where I'm going to source or where the country is I'm going to work in, it's then continuously monitoring that risk. That's really important from a financial stability perspective, from a corporate responsibility perspective, and just to be aware of what's happening, in the world around us. And I think I think you'll all see in this conversation, I'm so enthusiastic about what Prism has to offer.
So, Michelle's thoughts on the change in macro risk for procurement teams in the last couple of years, from her perspective, are you seeing similar at Prism?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think there's been a really big transformation in how seriously organizations are having to take these sorts of issues. And I think it's not even just a 2 or 3 year journey, really. From our perspective, it's more like a 10-year journey of when we first started working on this sort of stuff, which was, more than 10 years ago, when it was really early bubbling up in terms of discussions around Brexit, the 2016 US election, for example, and the first rumblings of the US-China trade war back then. There was really no sense that this was going to become a massive strategic issue for the long term for procurement and supply chain organizations, and really a bit of a scramble to react to those kinds of things. And it wasn't an immediate uptick in capability to get to where we are today. It's been a long journey of building up the organizational muscle, building up the resources to deal with these kinds of things. And I do think, just to connect it back to some broader procurement functional trends, it really has tied into a couple of those, I think, as well. One of which being that there's definitely an effort to move procurement from being a sort of a cost center, or seen as a cost center, to more of a value center for an organization. And I think being on the front lines of some of these very, very strategic global issues is a big advantage in that, to be able to provide information to the rest of the organization that's really valuable. And then the other side of it is digital procurement, where everybody's trying to digitize what they're doing. And so that's coincided a lot with how they intake this sort of information, the way in which that information has to be provided and analyzed in a more data-driven and technology-based way. And so that's coincided a lot with the way that we work and the way that we provide solutions.
And if I can, sorry, Andrew, to interrupt, one area there I think that George is really important as well is, whenever we say how has it evolved, within the supply chain, this is not something that's new, okay? Macro risk, economic solutions, everybody's been aware of it, but it's the fact that Prism has realized how impactful it is to supply chain. I mean, they are a niche market. I don't know anybody else that's actually focusing specifically on how do these particular elements of risk actually impact supply chain. And I think that's where, we can see the development, the emergence of these other roles even within the supply chain that are specifically looking at these areas, or how do they need to address these areas, or how do they need to change their processes. And I think that's something else we need to be very aware of, that, it's very new industry, it's very specific, and the niche market that Prism are providing, is going to be, as I said, I've said it before, instrumental across the supply chain, especially over, I think, the next, 4 years, as we have presidential elections in the US, Europe, and numerous other areas, globally. It's going to be even more important.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle, in preparation for this call, I was looking at the number of elections that are taking place this year globally. And it's amazing when you actually look at the full list. Of course, we've got the UK, French one was called, I think it was last week. Obviously, I mentioned the US election. And for organisations that are facing this political sort of uncertainty, if you will, George, right now this year, have you seen any change in behaviour, particularly because of the large number of elections, which could, well, in the case of the American one, it's difficult to predict. Others might seem a bit more predictable. Have you seen anything specifically change from procurement supply chain teams on the back of that this year?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a couple of ones that I think are definitely worth mentioning. It has been, at least with our clients, the big topic and known for a while, that there are a lot of very, very big elections. I believe this is the, just in terms of number of people going to vote, the largest year for democracy in history. And that allows some sort of foresighting on what the big changes might be. And so we've definitely seen our clients start taking that really seriously ahead of time in terms of preparing for potential policy changes. Couple of examples being, the ESG landscape has been a bit volatile from a regulatory perspective this year. That is not coincidental because of elections, in our view. So there's been a lot of preparation necessary for that. The sort of potential for a second trade war between the US and China, if Trump is reelected, has been on everyone's radar, and now it's already begun early because the Biden administration is already doing tariffs, and that's their own approach to doing industrial policy has created some trade tensions with other trade partners as well. And following what's happening in China, people are just having to react because now the EU has sort of trade conflict with China as well. So there's definitely been a lot of reactivity, but or preparation, I guess, for changes that are happening now. I think the thing that we are appreciative, or the thing that I find most rewarding in what we're seeing with clients, is the extent to which some of our clients are preparing for the really big things that might be coming, because we've seen smaller policy changes. It would be good if we're ahead of this, or good if we switch supplier there. But the big things that drive huge historic problems are the things that happen, once a year, once every few years. The Russia-Ukraine war being an example, Israel-Gaza war, COVID, the things that are just the big disruptive events. And I think the biggest change we've seen with our clients is taking those things really seriously, thinking about what is the menu of a few things that is going to be very, very disruptive in the next few years, and how can we do a real deep dive on exactly what it would look like if that happens, how our tools are going to hold up in that environment, what our responses are going to be, what should we change now. That's been heartening for us.
Yeah, indeed. You get events of that size and scale of impact. It really makes people think, doesn't it? And it also makes you wonder, when it's such a bewildering range of different variables to take into account, how did they ever manage risk before tools like TYS and Prism existed, of course. So yeah, so thank you for that insight into the sort of the headlines, if you will, of what the solutions can do. Unfortunately, we had a few connection problems with Johan, so he's not been able to contribute as much as we would have liked. But we're going to record a second session shortly, where we're going to dig into the real value solutions these solutions can provide in tandem, and look at a particular case study of one or two customers. So thank you for joining us. I hope you found that valuable, and please do watch out for the second installment of this discussion on our YouTube channel. George, Michelle, Johan, thank you all for your contributions. I've really enjoyed being informed and educated in what you guys are doing.